John Craighead, lecturer of mathematics and statistics, faculty of science. Danny Dyer, professor of mathematics and statistics, faculty of science. And Jonathan Anderson, professor, electrical computer engineering, faculty of engineering and applied science. Further ado, presentation.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Are you going to do introductions, Sean? Oh, further introductions? That's it.
I think you've been introduced.
Okay. Thanks, folks, for coming along. I'm guessing, am I clicking here? I'm clicking here, probably. So we are very interested in people's opinions and feelings about how sort of marking works. I don't think it's necessarily an obvious thing that we all mark in the same way. So I thought we might kick things off by just talking for a second about exactly what's happening. If you just come in, we would ask everyone to fill out one of these little pop quizzes here. You please use the fake name that's sort of associated with it if you're near one of them. This is sort of part of our demo that we're going to do later on. So just out of curiosity, you know, and I know I've asked you to do two things at once, which is terrible pedagogy, right? But I will say, you know, when it comes to marking, like what we do and why is sort of important. So for instance, you know, I'm a math professor, so I teach, one of the big aspects of my teaching is weekly assignment. And whenever someone has a weekly assignment, of course, the assignment has to be marked. Normally, these can be anywhere between 2 to 3 pages to maybe 10 pages, and students prepare some short answer, some long answer questions, and then they'll be marked by some teaching assistant. So out of curiosity, what do you folks teach? And in particular, like what kinds of things do you evaluate? How do you evaluate them?
I teach computer graphics. I evaluate knowledge in a little bit of math, a little bit of programming, a little bit of the theory, a little bit of the libraries. So a little bit of everything. Mm-hmm.
So what do students sort of produce for you that you would actually stop and sort of give some kind of grade to or evaluate?
So they produce projects, like they do like submissions, they do interim assignments, they do participation in class, like they with the top hat,
yep.
And then they do also like their examinations, midterm and final.
Okay, that's fantastic. Yep. What class stuff do you teach?
I'm in sociology, so I teach a lot of social inequality, a lot of race and gender, but then I also teach quantitative methods. So I do a bit of quant work, I do a bit of critical analysis. Some classes are sort of self-reflections. The quant work is much more lab-based.
When you say lab, so what a student would produce, is a lab like a sort of a long essay? Is it an R worksheet? Is it?
Yeah, so I teach out of SPSS, so it's the output from SPSS, and then typically they would put it together with a bit of analysis for me.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah. Anyone else want to share something that they work on? We're interested to know what our audience is. Like, what kind of stuff do people do?
I'm not an instructor, but I'm an instructional staff. Mostly I work with computer science, but like your whole logic aspect.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of math, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so there are a variety of different things that can be evaluated, and what we are doing here is not going to be talking about some kind of panacea, one-shot solution for everything. In-class evaluation, I wouldn't even touch, right? It terrifies me. I'd be terrified to try to do it. But what we're going to talk about is a sort of a suite of tools, one example of a style of thing that is quite useful in handling a bunch of the things that have already been discussed. We think it can give essentially not only better, more detailed feedback, but it allow us to do it in a sort of quick way. But also, I think, and I'm sort of almost stepping on John's toes here, but I don't want to get too far into it without losing human agency in the process, right? So that's essentially what do we grade and how and why. We've sort of been through this discussion, and I'm quite happy to have a comparison. Once again, John was very, very kind to donate some. This is living archival material from a young John Anderson's homework assignment. And, at least for us, this is a fairly typical homework assignment. You're asked to do something. You're given something that's written, you have to stop and you give a long form answer. It's a complicated question. It's not worth just a single point. It's not right or wrong. A human being has to stop and sort of interpret it and give a grade. But it's very common to see something like this back. Now, oftentimes a professor will give sort of complete solutions, but you've gone through and done something, you get a grade 4, maybe 4 out of 6. You don't exactly know what went wrong. Something is definitely wrong over here, right? The TA very kindly went through and marked off that there was something wrong, but we don't necessarily know what, right? And we hope for good students that between taking this small bit of feedback and perhaps a perfectly worked solution, that the students will be able to somehow interpret what they've missed or what they need to do. Now, the tool that we're going to use, oh, bugger, wrong space bar. The tool that we are going to use, GradeScope, actually gives a much more detailed kind of rubric. So the student can still sort of submit things as we normally expect. But over here, now all of a sudden, they're going to have access to a precise, essentially mark by mark breakdown of how we actually grade these things. Now, some of these things are quite useful in the sense that there's 2 points sort of involved here, and then a breakdown of those 2 points. But as well, you can have individual items here where you just stop and say, oh no, you've just sort of missed something altogether. Perhaps there's an error here, much more generic. So these rubrics can be incredibly detailed, and as a result, at least for our students, they're getting much better feedback than they've ever gotten before, because they're getting some idea into exactly what the professor thinks is important in a question. And to be very specific, we can even leave sort of long form comments for things. These can be tied directly to rubric items. So people who fail to do something, these sort of be populated automatically. And in particular, once you leave a long form comment, that comment is remembered, so you can call it up again and again. So all students can benefit from having this kind of long form comment rather than just sort of an individual case by case basis. An awful lot of my comments have often been so or why, and something was heavily circled. And now we have the option to give much more detailed feedback as a result. Now, with that being said, we did say we were going to talk about AI, and I'm very happy to turn this over to my colleague to talk about exactly that.
Right. So when we say education and AI, I hope that is kind of getting your spidey senses going, maybe putting up some red flags, maybe getting ourselves into a mood where we're going to be at least thinking very critically about whatever we hear next, because there's an awful lot of salesmanship in the world of AI where it says the artificial intelligence will fix everything and we won't need humans to do the human thing anymore because the computers will just do it for us. That's definitely not what we want. So there are some very, very legitimate fears in this space. As we're talking about in education and in teaching and in evaluation, as generative AI tools become more and more common, of course, people are finding new and creative and interesting ways to use them. In some cases, we have educators who are trying to figure out, well, how can I use these things in a way that augments my teaching practice, but doesn't replace it, doesn't dehumanize, or doesn't outsource my judgment about what's good and what's not. But the thing that, of course, people are really quite afraid of is that it seems that some people are starting to use these tools without doing the work of thinking critically about what is appropriate and what is not first. And I know that I see headlines like this and I get A, a little horrified, and B, well, no, horrified is good enough. We can stop there. So that is not what we're talking about. When we're thinking about grading, there are always important ethical questions to be considered. And if we pretend that there aren't, well, then we're fooling ourselves. So this is a picture of, this is my 8-year-old, and he's sitting on my lap, and he's helping me mark. Or when they were younger, we would say, Daddy is playing X's and O's. Yeah, and so here I'm saying, all right, Bucko, I want you to hit Q, or press 1, which means open rubric item 1, then Q, and then E, and number 2, number 4, then press Z, we go to the next question, or the next student, etc. So he is somehow involved in the marking here. And of course, there are issues, there are questions that you should be thinking and asking yourself, and hopefully my answers are satisfactory. So, what are the questions you ought to be thinking at this point? Like to keep things super interactive, if at all possible.
How are you compensating him?
Oh, there we go. That is not one that I was thinking about. There were probably cookies involved. Actually, no. I think the actual answer is that he really, really, really loves the sound of this mechanical keyboard, and he's like, "Daddy, can I help?" I'm like, "Well, all right, fine." So yeah, but no, that's excellent. I didn't even think about that. Our TAs don't get paid enough, but this one in particular, yeah. What other ethical questions come up for you?
Privacy.
Yeah, privacy for sure. Like if this guy is sitting here looking at like a list of student names, that'd be kind of problematic, right? In the days when I used to bring home 180 final exams on paper and put them in a bag and walk home and have this huge bag and bring it, right? Then I've got 180 exams that are sitting there on a table. And for sure, if one of my kids wanted to, if they were older and maybe if they had friends who were just a couple of years older, yeah, if they wanted to sneak into the dining room, that's probably not able to stop them. Related questions around privacy. Anybody ever had an exam go missing? Yeah, I did once, just once. There was one student who had a number of special circumstances, et cetera, had to write the exam in a deferred way. And then I went into my office and so he wrote the exam. I put it on top of the pile of exams that had already been received and I had already started marking, or in fact, I'd finished marking. I went home. I came into my office the next day. The door was open a crack and there was an exam missing from the top of the pile, which is crazy, but stuff happens. Now it was the summertime in the engineering building when the door frames expand a little bit. So yeah, it might be that it just popped open. Maybe somebody came in. Anyway, I don't know how or why, but certainly there are huge privacy considerations. We have TAs who are helping us. And in some cases, my TAs are graduate students marking papers from their fellow graduate students, right? There are related questions that are not necessarily about privacy, but about favoritism and partiality and unconscious bias. I have a paper with a name on it and I'm flipping through and I'm seeing who wrote it. I'm like, oh, come on, I can't believe you would make that mistake. Like, you know better than that. Well, maybe they didn't really. Maybe I shouldn't penalize them quite as much as the others because they knew better, or penalize them worse because they ought to have known better, right? What are the kinds of ethical issues come up for people? What questions should we be asking ourselves as we do this work of evaluating either summative evaluation or formative? Yes.
Yeah, that was the one I was going to bring up. That oftentimes, certainly students often treat what we would consider formative evaluation as something. Students don't collect papers. They never ever look at an assignment once again. It's marked, it's submitted, the grade appears. They never actually even look at the feedback they've given.
So one question I had was about the competency of the grader, right? So like, are you having like is this for real?
Yeah, so this is for real, but in this case, I am literally saying, all right, press number 2, now press the letter Q, now press W, now press Z. So he's not using, he's not passing any judgment. He's not doing the work of evaluating, but he is doing the mechanical work that is involved in the evaluation being transmitted from me to the student, for sure. Okay, so, and that, excellent segue. Thank you, Sarah. I didn't plant this gentleman in the audience. We all, whether we think we do or not, outsource some aspects of our grading practice. Nobody actually does this. Full DIY. We take away Brightspace, we take away Excel, we take away a calculator, we take away your abacus, and it's just you and the paper and you're adding up all the marks and calculating all the final grades using long division or something. I mean, I guess if we want to be really DIY, we take away your pencil too, and you have to do it in your, right? So nobody's actually doing this. We are all outsourcing some of the mechanical aspects, some of the activity of grading, depending on how much, how sophisticated we'd like to get in our final evaluation marking schemes and stuff. I didn't use the word drone because of trademarks or whatever, but you know, the bubble sheet approach, where in that case, we're not only outsourcing some of the activity, we're actually outsourcing a little bit of judgment, right? You take a whole bunch of Scantron sheets and you run them through a scanner, and then you are outsourcing to this company that made a scanner whether or not a student filled in this bubble enough. Things like that, right? So there's a little bit of outsourcing that's happening there. Now, the thing that everybody's worried about, of course, is this. Take this paper, feed it into ChatGPT and say, hey, ChatGPT, give me a critique of this paper and assign a number. And it will do it. It won't be based on any sound pedagogical principles, but it will, I mean, generative AI tools are trained to produce things that sound like the kind of text you found on the internet. And so it will happily produce the kind of text that you would find on the internet if somebody wanted to say some words about a paper, right? So it will definitely do that, not well. And that's the thing people are afraid of. And that's not at all what we want to propose. But we do submit to you, and this kind of came up in the questions, we do already outsource some of our judgment, right? If you have a class with 150 to 180 students, you're probably not marking it all by yourself, right? And there are different people who are part of the instructional team who have different levels of experience, who are entrusted with different amounts of judgment in that process, right? We have TAs and markers who I might give a very, very detailed rubric saying out of these 16 different things, look for which ones apply to this, and I'll decide this is worth 0.5, this is worth 2, this is worth something. The TA goes and they do that. There are more experienced TAs who have been around the course for 2 or 3 years, and in some cases, I can give them a bit more leeway, a bit more rope, because they're developing in their own educational experience and teaching practice, and maybe they're getting ready to do the graduate program in teaching or something. In that case, you know, some of these students who've been around and they know the course, they know the students, they know how it flows really well, they can be given a little bit more leeway, right? Why don't you here, take this question, I'll give you a much less detailed rubric. I'll get you to evaluate according to it and also make some judgment calls about what constitutes good versus excellent in this aspect of the question, things like that. Are the claims in this case study report supported by the evidence of the references that have been cited? Well, that's something that I can trust an experienced TA with, but not a new TA. And then we have lab instructors, right? The lab instructor in my huge first year course, I mean, she makes up what are the expectations for the project, when are the deliverables, and who's going to mark which aspects of which deliverables. She just completely runs that because she knows what she's doing. And so she's a professional and she's trusted with as much judgment as I trust myself with on some aspects of the course. So we already outsource judgment to people. What we're talking about is not this. We're talking today about this stuff, adding more tools to allow the outsourcing of some of the mechanical, more laborious aspects of the grading activity to allow these human beings to spend less time on that stuff and more time on giving higher quality feedback to students. And we have found that this is extremely helpful in our own teaching practice. So I guess at this point we've collected some things. Our colleague has scanned some things in, and what we are going to do now is
Sorry,
oh, okay. So what we're going to do here, I am going to take these PDFs that have been uploaded for us or that you have filled out for us. I'm going to upload them into this tool that we're using now. There are other tools that can do this. We happen to be using a tool called Gradescope. We find it's really, really helpful. It's not the only tool in the world that does this. This is not an advertisement for one company, but this is what we've been using and we find it very helpful. And so you can see what's going on here is.
I think you can delete this one with two.
Okay. Oops. All right. So yeah, you can see here, we have PDFs in which it's split the different, now, if you have a long exam, it'll say, well, here's the first 14 pages and these seem to match up. Oh, somebody tore off the formula sheet at the back. So this one's 14, but this one's 16. Yeah, this looks like it's probably the right split point between this student and that student, but you can double check it and stuff. And if we have some duplicates here, as sometimes happens, so after a final exam,
That one is still good.
Oh. sorry, you want me to delete just 1 and 2?
Group 1 and 2.
Okay. Yeah, so after a final exam, I will take all of my exams. I will go to the copy room. I will take the big paper cutter and cut the corners off of all the paper, and it all goes into the scanner. Chunk, 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 chunk. And then I email those PDFs to myself from the scanner, and then we have exams, which also prevents the problem that we've seen before of students taking their midterm away, changing it, and coming back and saying, you gave me a 2 out of 5, but I should have had 4 out of 5, because look, I did the extra part. We've seen that before too. Don't see that anymore now that we're doing this. There we go. So now we have these different submissions that have been scanned in. Oh, in order to see part of the demo, I have to turn off the anonymous grading first. Sorry, we'll turn it back on when we show you the real demo. There we go. And now I'll let John take it away from here.
I almost took that away. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to deal on the steps that have happened after this. And so the first step after you've scanned in the assignments is it identifies the students. And you might notice that all this handwriting is very legible. It's because the program digitizes the handwriting. So that's true even with the questions when you go to correct them, that all the handwriting's been straightened around so you can actually read it, right? It identifies students that are in the class. And then if it can't determine somebody, it tells you it can't determine it, and it lets you determine who it is. So it doesn't leave somebody out. It doesn't, say, oh, this is a good enough match. It says, you have to decide about this as a human person. So this is now, we've got the paper scanned in, and we've got the names attached to the papers. Jonathan, what do I do? Hit return?
Well, actually, sorry, it looks like in this particular case, although we have a name and a student number blank, we didn't separate them out. So normally what I'll see is 112 have been automatically matched to the roster by student
Right.
number and name. And then there's 12 or whatever that I need to kind of fix up myself. It looks like this is one big box. So actually, let's not go through all of them, but you can see this is kind of the process that you would go through.
And also work by student number as well as.
Yeah.
As well as terribly written names.
And sometimes, and I got my colleagues as they were helping me fill in some of these recently, I got some of my colleagues to write in the wrong student number because students do that. Sometimes they misspell their own name and all that happens too. So now you are all set.
Okay, so in this part of you saw the questions come up 1 to 4 in the previous screen, and this part of the program is actually grouped like answers together. All right, now it's only grouped by the box, and so you could say to yourself, well, that's not really relevant because this guy is in a blank group, but he's got all sorts of writing here, right? And you might say, well, someone might just written the answer in the box and got it off their neighbor. So what happens is that you have to audit these boxes. So
It's on the laptop though.
yeah, on the laptop, yeah. You have to audit these boxes.
Scroll with 2 fingers.
Okay.
2 fingers like that.
Right. And so what happens is that you would take, first of all, any that are the same and you'd merge them. Jonathan, I'm going to get you to do the upper.
Sure. Why don't you talk and I'll be your demo assistant?
That's right. So we had to switch computers all of a sudden. Yes. Yeah, great.
Yeah, no, I'll just do it here while you talk.
Okay, great.
So you point at the screen and tell me what you want.
Yeah, so what I'd like to have done now is if there are any similar ones, I'd like to merge them. So are there any similar ones? No, right? Labor, radar, abroad, blank. Okay, so now I want to audit, and we won't audit every group, but let's take a group and audit it. And we'll see that in this group, which is blank, there really are not blank, right? So we'll kick them out of the group, right, Jonathan?
This is the labor group.
This is the labor group?
Yeah.
Okay, this is the labor group, excuse me. So these do have labor, all right? So this group is okay, so we certify the group. And then if we ran across the blank group, so there's an example where this guy is definitely blank, this person, not personally, but their answer is. And this one is, has actually answered. So we've removed this person from the group. So they would not be marked as part of that group. They'd go into ones to be marked individually. So we go through all the groups like that. And again, we approve them or not approve them. And Jonathan, why don't you just run through them and approve them? Okay. Now, these are all the people that were not in groups. Okay, so these have not got into groups. So now what we can do is we can take, so here's a labor. We can take labor and we can drag it up into the labor group. And we could take loader and loader. I see two loader. No, I saw a loader. So let's say there were more than one loader. We could create a new group over here with a loader. And we could drag that one into loader, right? So we continue to work these down. We got two larboards, right? So we create another group for larboard, which is actually the right answer. Or one of the right answers. And we continue to do that. So we work this general group down. This is ones we're gonna have to mark individually. We've now got like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We've got 11 we're gonna have to mark individually out of many more submissions, right? So once we've checked the groups, then we're gonna continue the grading. And the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to grade all the groups. And when we grade the groups, they're going to get the same mark because we've audited them. And they're going to get the same comment. So the comments could be entered for them too as well. So we've got, Jonathan just picked something out of here's the rubric that Danny talked about. And this person had a recognizable word, not a 6 or 7 letter word, but a recognizable word. So we mark those, and then we go on, and let's say we go on to, well, we'll have to go through question 1 to get to question 2, but all the question 1s are going to follow each other. All right, so that we're able to mark them all one after another and compare them. And then we're going to go to question 2. And the nice thing about this is you've seen it can recognize text. Down here, you're going to see it can recognize symbols and group symbols. And here we're going to see that it can recognize multiple choice and group multiple choice. And then finally, in the last question, you can see that it can look at schematics, which is off the screen right now. So let's get through number 1, Jonathan, if we can. There, so now we're going to go to question 2. So you see, it's actually grouped these symbolics together. And you can do the same thing for Venn diagrams. You can do the same thing for chemistry models. You can do the same thing for logic. I teach a logic course, and I have people write a sentence, and it analyzes a sentence, right? So you can, group by whatever the common thread is. And so again, we go through the same process of auditing the groups to make sure they're the same. And obviously, we kick out that person because they didn't actually do it. And we kick out this person from the group. And then I see we've got some 1 over n's and some signs mixed up. So we take out the ones that are not, the group that we're auditing right now is sign group, right? So we drag and we get ourselves down to a minimum number of assignments we had to mark individually. All right? So that's number 2, and Danny's right, if you go back to the next page, you can actually just click on number 3.
But you can see we got through 88% of that in a minute and a half.
Right. Okay, now Jonathan's does a fair bit of grading by multiple choice as a part of his exam. And this shows you how it can actually group by the circles that people fill in. So it put all the chocolates together, all the vanillas together, all the strawberries together. And it did the same thing. So we can audit those groups and make sure they're right. It's not fussy about the symbols. It caught the fact we use a slash rather than filling in. Check mark rather than filling in. And then if we get to the more interesting one, which is the last one. There. So here's the symbol question. Now, if you look over here, here's this beautiful picture, which shows you in the rubric, shows you what the right number of triangles are. So, you know, just to sate your curiosity, we have individual triangles within the boxes, and then we have bigger triangles that assume you can go back to the red there. Bigger triangles that take 2 boxes, and then we've got these huge triangles that take a corner of the square. And so there's 30 different triangles in that symbols. Now we're going to have a look at how we haven't asked for it to be grouped. We're going to group this purely manually. So if we look at the first person here, they've clearly got the ones that are in the first item of the rubric, right? They've clearly got these center ones, right? Okay, so we give them a point for the having the ones that are in the rubric or that are in the boxes, right? So 1 point. Okay, and then we would go to the next person. And the next person also got the same idea, except they also got the bigger ones too, right? They got the individual ones and the bigger ones, and they got 22. So we've got the 18 and we've got the 4, which is items 1 and 3.
And we should also show you that with the anonymous grading on, which was the thing that I had on earlier, when we're doing all of this, we'll have a different TA mark each question, like you do all question 1, you do all question. And as they go through, they see that this is student WRY8FEA1. And even if they try to look at the top, blanks out who the student was.
Perfect. Yeah. So we would go through, and if we go through another, if we grade this person for 1 and 3, because they've realized the pattern. John, yeah, there we go. Now this person has just written 26. So they haven't like actually done any analysis. They've written 26, and we would give them probably 1 point. So now there's not in the rubric. So if we go down to the bottom, Jonathan, we can give them a supplemental point for 1 point, or we can add a rubric item. So we can add one more, right? We can add one more point, right? So that's basically how it works. And then after you're done marking, then it will generate a report for the student, which was what you saw in the rubric, which was side by side. And it'll generate all the comments for the student that were made about their assignment. And it will email the assignment back to the student. So it's a complete circle, right? Now we're on to code auto grading. Jonathan, thank you.
Okay, so How many folks in your teaching do things where you get students to submit code that gets where you would like it to be at least partially auto-evaluated? I know I do programming stuff. I heard computer science, SPSS. Is that something where students will submit code that gets run and then you see what numbers come up? Yeah, fantastic. All right, so it's not a huge number of people in the room, so we won't spend too long on this. But stuff that I do, like in my first year course, I will write test cases for assignments where I tell students, here's what you're required to do. I've invented a little game, and you're going to write some Python code that manages this little game where squares go this way and triangles go that way, like inspired by the John Klassen book. And they don't actually play tricks on each other, but that's all right. Sorry, it's my colleague reminding me of some paperwork that I meant to be saying. Okay, and so I'll write test cases that look like ordinary Python unit tests, that kind of thing, where here's a test for place a starting square. So I'm going to check that when I call the student's place piece function, I expect it to return true if I pass in this board and triangle and things like that. And each of these tests is given a number. It's actually just a string, but anyway, they call it a number, and you can have things like 3.10, meaning question 3, sub question 10. I know my math colleagues are not happy about the usage of number in that very fluid, flexible way, but anyway. So you can assign a weight, because some questions reflect a lot more effort, et cetera, and they should be weighted more highly. And we can also, in some cases, say that I'm going to have some tests, and this is a grading thing, so I'm going to use my red pen to point. We can say that some tests are only going to be visible to students after publication. So I will have, here are some tests that you can see up front. I will allow students to submit their code and immediately get a view of how it's working. And of the tests that I've published, they can see it passes this one, fails that one. Oh, that's because I have silly misunderstanding of the expectations. I don't want students to lose all the points because of that kind of an error. And so they'll get immediate feedback, and then they can revise and resubmit all the way up to the deadline. Now that's up to the instructor, but that's the way I like to do it. And then I'll have other tests that they only see after the due date has passed, so that we don't have people writing code that just corresponds exactly to the test expectations. So I write tests that look kind of like regular unit tests, and then they get automatically run for me in this framework. And students see results that kind of look like this. So they will see, here are some tests that you did not, or that did not pass for you. Here's some tests that did pass. Here is output that came out of your code when it was running. So maybe if you have some extra information that you're printing, so you can say, I made it this far, that kind of information is visible. And for people who really like to geek out, there's a couple of ways that you can make this stuff work. And this is true for Gradescope. It's also true for Prairie Learn, which is some other software that we're looking at and possibly evaluating, where either you can write sort of scripts that tell the autograder how to set itself up and run your code, or if you like building Docker images, you can do that kind of thing yourself and actually use a custom Docker image, so that instead of this step having to happen every time each student submits their work, it's something that you do once. And something that I find particularly helpful, you can even, because this is all run in containers in AWS, blah, 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 you can actually SSH, so you can log into the auto grading container as it runs to look at what's going on and if you are getting more obscure. So when I don't really have to do this very much with students writing Python. When I have students who are writing C, sometimes I need to see why is it that your output is just completely broken and nothing's coming in out at all? Is it because of a mistake you made, or is it because I forgot to install some version of a library that was supposed to be in the container? And so you can check that kind of thing. Oh, and the other thing that you should see here is that you can test anything that can produce a JSON file in a particular format. So that means, although the friendly folks who make this tool have provided libraries in a couple of languages to work with, and I actually adapted some stuff that I had, or some code that I had written for auto grading that solved half of the problem, and these people solved the other half of the problem. So I adapted that to produce this format. anything that you can write that would produce this output, doesn't matter what language it is, will work. And so you can also use this for other programming languages like C and C++ and assembly or shell scripts or kind of whatever you like.
Thanks, John. So we've sort of come to the conclusion of our remarks. More or less, a few points may have gotten missed along the way. First off, this is a pretty quick process. Obviously, you guys submitted your quizzes in the room, and I scanned them and uploaded them. You saw all the work happen for those, as well as some dummy papers that we prepared. In practice, I teach a class this past winter of 66 students. I scanned all the midterms to PDF and had them sort of input inside 15 minutes. None of the hassle of slapping papers around, trying to give them back to people, having a stack of assignments that no one's ever picked up. None of that stuff happens to me anymore. It's all digitally. Students can access it whenever they feel like, including the complete marked rubric. As John said, all these things, when I used to finish marking, one of the last things I would do, of course, was, well, now I will add them all up. And now I will alphabetize them. And finally, I will record them in Brightspace. But now transmission to Brightspace happens instantly. For a 100-person class, which I often teach, that's 2 to 3 hours work. Sort of at the end of your course, after you're finished. So I think there's a lot of small benefits. I will say is that we've seen John's thing about AI and where we sort of think we are in this chart, right? We have the scary stuff that we don't endorse. But everything we've looked at today has been down here. Just essentially how to give you more power in the grading that you have. Some of it is to do it faster, some of it's to do it better. Using this stuff, we can get question by question breakdown. So I might have a 10-point, a typical midterm is 50 points. Each question individually worth 5 points. Now I can know that everyone got number 5 wrong. But not just because I kind of felt like that when I was going through marking, but I can know exactly how well or poorly people do. So there's a chance to study what's actually happening here that we often don't even have before, or at least never had the time. So the thought is that generative AI can essentially take away our agency, that we're giving something up, that we're going to use AI to mark, and we're divorcing ourselves from the process, and we don't want that. That is a loss, right? And it's immoral, frankly, right? It's an unethical thing to do. But there are other new worlds out there, right? We have the option to take what these tools can do and use them in our control to make what we do better and use them in a straightforward and ethical way. So we can teach faster and better. So what we are hoping to do is to maximize humanity and take all these other people, including ourselves, and stretch them out to make the activities more efficient. So we don't need to rely on other kinds of tools. That's certainly our goal as your speakers, but we'd love to hear, we'd love to hear what you guys think about it. So, do you think there's a room for some of these sorts of marking tools in your teaching? If you have any questions or comments, we'd all love to hear. Lisa got her running shoes on. she can do this.
So I don't teach, but I sometimes deal with issues students have with professors, and they'll say, "Professor, this question, they're not answering my email. I'm not sure what to do." Like, can this help with cases where there might be an error does inadvertently happen in grading?
I mean, it really does. Obviously, which system you use will vary greatly, but in GradeScope is a thing called request regrade. And so essentially a student can say there's a problem here for this particular question. You know, they can be as specific or unspecific as they want. I use a marker for our assignments. My marker normally has that built into its time and just responds to those requests. On midterms and big pieces of evaluation, I see them directly. They're very quick. They're pretty efficient. Sometimes you can just say, be more explicit. Which rubric items do you think are wrong? You know, so the classic thing of just, I want more marks is not a very effective thing. but I'm happy to entertain students, and sometimes if there's 10 regrade requests from one student, just like, just drop by my office and let's chat about this, because there's something you're really not getting here right now. So definitely possibilities there, sure.
Yeah, and something that I find two things related to that. One is, sometimes there'll be a regrade request that comes in because like a student on a longer piece of evaluation, they, in a lab report question or part 3, you got the credit for this, but you didn't demonstrate the work. A regrade request will come in and say, that was on page 4, but when I said part 3, it's only on page 2 and 3. They select which pages it's on for a longer form thing. I missed that, sorry. Okay, now we'll take another look, they get it. Another thing that happens that I really, really like, who has had the horror of getting 3/4 of the way through marking a huge complicated question on a final exam, and then you realize, I should be giving more partial credit for people who do this. Now I've got to go all the way back through and find everybody who did that and say, you know what, you get another couple of points for that. One thing that I love is I can build the rubric as I go. So I'll mark the first 10 or whatever, and then I'll hand it over to the TAs, and I'll have developed a nice clean rubric by the time they get it. But also sometimes a regrade request will come in and the student will be like, sir, I demonstrated that I understood the concept, but I made a silly error, and yet I ended up with 2 out of 6. And if I look at it and say, you've got a really good point there. Well, you know what? That rubric item was worth 2. Now it's worth 3. And it just changes it for everybody, like resync to Brightspace, and now everybody's grade has gone up, and that student's a hero.
Okay, my question is about the use of the word language for the examples that you showed, because I am a language pro. I'm modern languages, so I've always been curious about the use of that word, because in my world, a language has these components, some grammar, syntax, semantics, and of course, the hidden meaning behind the words. So if you can talk about that, I'm curious to know.
Yeah, happy to. So, and actually we spent some time in my introductory programming course talking about some of those aspects of language and how our programming languages, like mathematical notations, are sort of synthetic languages that didn't grow up the way natural languages did and don't have some of the richness and the ambiguity and things. But they have syntax and grammar and semantics and all of these things. And in fact, different phases of compilation, turning that programming language into something the computer can run is actually things like there's a semantic parsing phase where we get a parse tree, and then that turns into a semantic analysis phase, which leads to other things, etc. So yeah, the programming languages that we're talking about, they're synthetic. They don't have the rich history of some other languages. They are extremely, extremely precise for that reason, kind of like in mathematical notation. If you put the I equals 0 under the big sigma or over it, there's a huge difference, right? So it's like a programming language interpreter or compiler is far more precise than any grammar teacher you ever had in grade 3 or whatever. But there is a lot of commonality there as well, I think.
There is no oral part. I mean, we use language to communicate. We're communicating now, and you don't use those languages to orally communicate as we do now.
Yeah. So I mean, maybe it's a good conversation to take offline, but there are some interesting overlaps in between where there's elements of what we put in programming languages that are actually not for the computer, but are just about communicating with other programmers who are going to come along later. And so there are elements of things that are much more free form and free expression because the computer isn't looking at them, that kind of thing. But yeah, fascinating conversations happening.
It is. And I also asked because we give students credit for previous knowledge of a language, German, Spanish. And then I think I have recently seen students requesting credit for that kind of language. And that, of course, creates issues for me and for us that are in that area. How are we going to do that?
Yeah.
and evaluate fluency.
Exactly, understanding, yes, that's becoming a thing. I mean, I can see that very often. But once in a while, I feel, oh, students that are going to request credit for these modules, and I'm like, well, I would be able, I would be able to give any credit, because that's not something
I'm sorry, folks, I'm gonna break in here, because we do have some other questions here, so there's a
Yeah.
question here.
I'm just wondering about more sort of generic feedback, like citations, wordiness, no introduction, no conclusion. Because I find generally with my marking, that's what takes me the longest, is just those very generic instructions. Can you build that into the rubric for them to be looking for?
I mean, absolutely. So we have a project-based course where, typically a project is worth 30 marks.
Right.
That's worth 30%. But of course, I never evaluate on 30.
Yeah.
I say, 5 marks will be for mathematics content, 4 marks will be for presentation.
Right,
So of course, every single one of those could be a question.
right,
And then, of course, using standard sort of, very good, excellent,
right.
good, poor, fair kind of things. You could assign grades, you could give particular examples of why that grade was there and so on. So it can be quite detailed.
So I'll have in reports that students submit, one of the questions, as Danny was saying, would be your conclusion. And there'd be rubric items for things like the conclusion makes assertions.
Right.
The assertions are supported by evidence
Right.
and those kinds of things.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, sorry, quick detail question, is Gradescope something we have a university site license for or something, or how does that work?
We do today, and we will through the end of the summer. And if you think it's something that you'd be interested in using in the future, you should email the dean. Because
So we have it on a trial basis, right?
we have been paying for it, and there are a group of people who think it will be extremely useful for us to continue to be able to use it. But as always, we're in an environment where costs are being evaluated. And we would have to make sure that to make sure it's continued available for us, we want to make sure that people are using it. Now, John has been doing the work in evaluating other systems, some cheaper, on exactly that front, in case we're forced out of this particular system. But John, I mean, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, I mean, Gradescope, at least in my opinion, is one of the better ones. But I did some work, my classes this term past, I used Op Exam in one class, and I used Plum, which is from UBC, in another class. And the Op Exam was very similar to Gradescope, but didn't have nearly the subtleties of Gradescope. And the Plum was more of a programmer's approach. So in other words, it was easy to mark with, but you had to do programming before you marked, right? So there are alternatives out there. And we've kind of got one or two in our back pocket in the event that our Gradescope license isn't renewed.
A lot of fun though.
Another question.
Okay.
We're being cut off.
Yeah, we're at the end of our session now, actually. I want to thank everyone that came here today to participate and our people online as well. I want to thank you, Danny, John, and John, for your participation here as well and a great presentation.